Good evening and welcome to the first lecture of the Maritain Fellows, specifically in this case the Undergraduate Maritain Fellows of the academic year. Tonight, I think, judging by the size of the audience, our guest needs no introduction. Professor Richard Swinburne is one of the most notable philosophers of religion and has been so for nearly 5 decades now. Professor Swinburne has contributed quite monumentally to discussions and debates on topics of the soul and philosophy of mind, to questions of the existence of God and proof thereof, and even philosophical arguments for the incarnation and the philosophical reality of Jesus Christ. Besides his 19 books and numerous additional articles, Professor Swinburne has enjoyed a long teaching career at Oxford University, where he was the Nolens Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion and is now an Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, also at Oxford. Professor Swinburne, thank you so much for your visit, especially in your old age. It really means a lot for you to come all the way across the pond and speak to us tonight at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you.
Don't forget the handout.
Yes.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's based on views which I have expressed a number of times in a number of places, and most recently in a book entitled Are We Bodies or Souls? I understand that the Society derives its special inspiration from the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, and also from Maritain's own vision of integral Christian humanism. While I regret my ignorance of Maritain's particular vision, I can certainly appreciate the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but I plan to discuss a topic on which his views were, in my view, partly right and partly mistaken. The topic is simply what makes me me. For Thomas, it is the union of two separate parts, my body and my soul, which is a non-physical part of me. His theory is a version of substance dualism, which I endorse, the view that there are normally on earth these two parts to me. But I hold that my soul is the one and only essential part of me, logically necessary and sufficient for my existence. My body is not necessary for being me, although it is normally physically necessary for my existence on earth and logically necessary for my full flourishing anywhere after death. Thomas, however, denied that the existence of my soul was sufficient for the existence of me in this sentence, anima non est ego, my soul is not me. This has strange consequences that while their bodies are in the grave, the saints are not in heaven. We can only pray to their souls. My view, which I shall now defend, is that of Plato and Descartes, that my soul is what constitutes me. That alone constitutes me. I shall approach this topic by considering theories of personal identity, and I hope you've all got a handout and can follow this here. A theory of personal identity is a theory of what makes one person P2 at a later time T2 the same person as a person P1 at an earlier time T1. For example, what makes George, accused in 2025 of having committed a murder in 1965, what makes him the same person as a person called George who committed that murder? One apparently obvious answer to that question is that P2 is the same person as P1, if and only if P2 has the same body as P1. But how much of the same body? Surely if someone has a heart transplant, they still continue to exist, but with a new heart. And similarly for any transplant of any other bodily organ except the brain. But the brain is special, because without our brain, we would, under normal earthly circumstances, not have any conscious experiences at all. So perhaps the answer to our question is that P2 is the same person as P1, if and only if P2 has the same brain as P1. But a similar question arises: how much of the same brain does P2 need in order to be the same person as P1? Although at present it's not possible for surgeons to replace a damaged brain part with a part transplanted from another body, that should become possible during the present century. So how much of someone's brain could be replaced before that person ceases to exist? One important fact about the brain which highlights this issue is this: the brain consists of two cerebral hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and a lower part, the cerebellum. Our conscious life depends on the upper part of the cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex. Patients suffering from some otherwise incurable epilepsy due to a malfunctioning hemisphere sometimes have parts of one hemisphere removed, and may even have the whole hemisphere removed in an operation called an anatomical hemispherectomy. What happens then is that most of the functions of that part, or whole hemisphere, are taken over by another part or by the other hemisphere, and the patient thinks and behaves in much the same way as before, except for not having epileptic fits, at least in the respect that their memories remain largely the same and their character is not very different. And it has been discovered only fairly recently that this is the case whichever of the two hemispheres are removed, which shows that there is very considerable overlap between the brain states of the two hemispheres, which give rise to conscious memories and character. Now, suppose that both hemispheres are removed from a person whom I will call Alexandra, and also from two other persons. Alexandra's left hemisphere is then connected to the brain of one of these persons, whom I will now call Alex, and Alexandra's right hemisphere is connected to the brain of the other person, whom I will now call Sandra. These probably both, Alex and Sandra, would claim to have been Alexandra, and they would claim to remember fairly accurately the details of Alexandra's past life, because they each have one cerebral cortex, and we've seen that each cerebral cortex will contain sufficient memories and character to be the same as those of Alexandra. But Alex and Sandra cannot both be Alexandra, because they are not the same person as each other. They leave the operation room by different doors and subsequently live different lives. But there are three possible outcomes of the operation. One is that Alex is Alexandra, the other is that Sandra is Alexandra, and the third possibility is that neither of them is Alexandra. Yet there would seem to be no possible subsequent experiment which could show which of these outcomes has occurred. For even if one of them remembers the events of Alexandra's life better than does the other, that may not be because that person is Alexandra, but simply because the traumatic operation has produced a greater degree of amnesia in one of the former persons than in the other. And even if neither of them can remember much about Alexandra's life, or even function very well, that is still compatible with them, one of them being Alexandra. The theories of personal identity prevalent in the English-speaking world of the last few centuries have been of three kinds: physical theories, mental or psychological theories, and mixed theories. A physical theory analyzes P2 at T2 being the same person as P1 at T1 in terms of having some or all of the same body or some or all of the same brain as P1. A mental theory analyzes P2 being the same person as P1 in terms of P2 having many largely true memories of the actions of P1 and a similar character to P1. A mixed theory contains elements of both physical and mental theories. All of these theories are what is known as complex theories, in the respect that P2 being the same person as P1 is to be analysed in terms of some specified degree of continuity of one or more features of P2 with those of P1. For example, a detailed brain theory of personal identity might have a continuity requirement that P1 is the same as P2 if and only if over any period of 5 years separating them, no more than 10% of P1's brain has been replaced by a part taken from the brain of some other person. So it would follow that P1 would be the same person as P2 if after 5 years only 9% of P1's brain has been replaced, but not if 11% of P1's brain had been replaced. A detailed memory theory might have a continuity requirement that P2 is the same as P1 if and only if over any period between T1 and P2, P1 does not lose more than 60% of her memories, so long as after every instant P2 has at least 61% of P1's memories, P2 is the same as P1, but if after some instant P1 has only 59% of the previous person's memories, P2 is not the same as P1. Needless to say, almost, such complex theories are open to the arbitrariness objection. It seems highly arbitrary to suppose that P2 is the same as P1 only if no more than 10% of P1's brain has been replaced over 5 years, but not P1 if more than 10% has been replaced. And a similar objection applies to mental and mixed theories. No conceivable experiment could show which of these theories was correct. All that an experiment could show is that P2 had such and such brain matter and had such and such memories and character, but the issue is whether the person who did have such and such brain matter and such memories and character is P2, and there could not be the slightest reason for preferring any one detailed theory of these kinds, which any philosopher might offer, over a somewhat different one. But which is the right theory is a very important matter, which would rightly influence human decisions. Consider the case of a patient who has a serious brain disease which can only be cured not merely by removing a certain part of the brain, but by replacing it with a part obtained from another brain. Before the patient agrees to undergo the operation, the patient will need to know whether they will survive the operation. A neuroscientist might be able to tell the patient whether the operation is likely to be successful, in the sense that after the operation there will be a living conscious person, and the neuroscientist might even be able to tell the patient how much of their past memory and character the subsequent person will have. But unless he or she has access to a true philosophical theory of personal identity, the neuroscientist will not be able to tell the patient whether they will survive the operation. It is because of the continuity between persons who have less and less of the brain matter of some person P1 and less of the memories and character of P1 that most of those who advocate complex theories of personal identity have moved to a theory of personal identity of a kind which reflects that continuity. This is what I call a partial identity theory. The claim of a partial identity theory is that the less and less of P1's brain matter and or memories and character a subsequent person P2 has, and the less and less gradual is the process by which the change occurred, the less is the identity of the subsequent person P2 with P1. Among the eminent philosophers who have advocated such a theory are Derek Parfit, Robert Nozick, and David Lewis. Parfit wrote of later persons being to different degrees survivors of the earlier person. Nozick wrote of them being continuers of the earlier person, to the extent to which they have physical and mental continuity with them. For all such writers, the only facts which a theory of personal identity needs to describe is the extent of such continuity, which constitutes the degree of partial identity with that of an earlier person. According to these philosophers, to call some future person identical with a past person is to use an imprecise ordinary language term to describe the case where some person has a very great degree, perhaps the maximum degree, of continuity with that past person. So the answer of these philosophers to what happens to Alexandra in the thought experiment, which I described earlier, is that both past subsequent persons are partly Alexandra. And if one of these persons had more of Alexandra's brain and memory, that person would be more identical to Alexandra than the earlier person, than the other person. Advocates of these theories point out that the identity of a later inanimate physical object with an earlier one is a matter of degree. A later table is naturally described as being partly the same as an earlier table if it is made of only some of the parts of the earlier material, earlier table. For example, if it has all the legs of the earlier table but a different tabletop. So, these philosophers claim we should say the same kind of thing about the identity of a person with an earlier person. But persons are very different from inanimate objects. If personal identity were ultimately a matter of degree of continuity between successive persons, the theory must hold that the earlier person has reason to fear to some extent the bad experiences and to hope for some extent of the good experiences of any later person who is partly identical to the earlier person. If the person is split, then these philosophers will have to say, well, each of them must have some of the experience, must have the earlier person must, after the passage of time, have to some extent the experiences of one and to some extent the experiences of the other. That's what the partial identity would consist in. But that leads to what I shall call the more than one candidate objection, which I regard as a conclusive objection to any such partial identity theory. On any theory on which persons' continued existence is a matter of degree, it is always possible for some person to have more than one survivor or continuer or whatever, although one of these may be a closer continuer than another. For example, if Alex has only 70% of Alexandra's brain, then the remaining 30% can be given to Sandra. And so while Alex is a close continua of Alexandra, Sandra is also a continua, although a less close one. But since they are both continuas, then Alexandra will be going to have, to different degrees, both the experiences of Alex and the experiences of Sandra. So if Alexandra knows in advance what is going to happen to her brain, and also knows that Alex is going to have a happy life and Sandra is going to have a miserable life, then Alexandra must expect to have a life that is partly happy and partly miserable, although, of course, more happy than miserable, because Alex is a closer continua than Sandra. But that cannot possibly be the case, since in this experiment, no future person is going to have a life that's partly happy and partly miserable. When the future time comes, one person has a happy life, one person has a miserable life. And Alex and Sandra will have quite different lives, and so neither of their lives will include a mixture of happiness and misery. Hope you've got that point. If you split the brain, then the person whose brain it was originally, and if he knows that one person going to have a happy life, one person going to have a miserable life, then he will know that being to partly this one and partly that one, he can reasonably expect to have a life which contains both happiness and misery. But no subsequent person will have a life that contains both. There will be Alex, who has a happy life, and Sandra, who has an unhappy life. And that's all that's happening at the later time. So this doesn't seem to be a conceivable situation. So what are we left with? In contrast to all such complex theories, a simple theory of personal identity claims that personal identity is all or nothing. Each person is or is not the same person as an earlier person, and there's no intermediate possibility. Certainly, the greater the continuity between P1 and P2 of brain memory and character, the more probable it is that P2 is P1. But this continuity is only probabilistic evidence of personal identity, which is something different from that continuity, which is evidence of it. So, why not just say that personal identity is unanalyzable? There are just analyzable truths about which person is the same person as the earlier person. Why not just say that we can't say anything more about it? The problem with this is it is incompatible with a highly plausible principle which I call the principle of the identity of composites, and if you're following on the handout, there it is, and which I will now explain. A substance is a thing which has properties, a component of the world, and it may or may not have other substances as parts. Thus, the Milky Way, my house, my desk, and each of the atoms of which the desk is made are all substances. They all have properties, including properties of shape, mass, volume, colour, and such like. Persons are substances. The principle of the identity of composites states that there couldn't be a substance different from an actual substance, which is made of all the same smaller substances as it, with the same properties, arranged in the same way, having the same history. Consider a certain car, C1, parked at a certain time in a car park. It has many different parts, engines, wheels, seats, and so on, arranged in a certain way. The car has had a certain history, during which it has gained or lost various properties and parts. Each of its parts has had a certain history. Now, is it possible that instead of C1, there could be instead a different car, C2, parked in the same place at that same time, which is made of all the same parts, arranged in just the same way, parts which have had all the same history as those of C1, and yet it's a different car. It doesn't make sense to suppose this. The history and properties of the car and the history and properties of its parts fully determine which car it is. Now, consider the earlier example of one of the two persons, let's say Alex, being formed of some of the bodily parts and having some of the memories of the experiences of Alexandra. Given the principle of the identity of composites, if the only parts of Alexandra and so of Alex were physical parts, then whether she is Alexandra or not would be fully determined by the parts. If they had all the same parts, they would be the same person. But given the simple theory of personal identity, that is false. Alex's physical parts and her physical and mental properties are not sufficient to determine who she is. So, in order to maintain the simple theory, we must hold that Alexandra has a non-physical, indivisible part, which I have called her soul, which is logically necessary for her existence. Hope you're with me on that argument. I'll just repeat it. The principle of the identity of composites said if a substance is made of all the same parts as another substance, and these parts have all the same properties as those of the earlier substance and all the same history, then that's the same substance. Now, if all there was to my earlier argument suggests that even if we know all about this Alex, about the parts that she is made of and the memories she has, that is not enough to determine whether or not she is the same person as Alexandra, and so it's not sufficient to determine who she is. So that means that she must have another part which determines who she is, and that part is the soul. If she has Alexandra's soul, she is Alexandra. If she doesn't have Alexandra's soul, she's not Alexandra. But, so that is the argument that having a soul is necessary for our existence because it determines who we are, and our survival depends on having the original soul, because nothing else will determine, and yet there will be a truth about whether we do or don't survive. But is it sufficient for someone's existence that they have such a part? I've argued so far that to the conclusion that it is necessary for my existence that I have a part which is an indivisible, non-physical part, which is essential for my existence. But is it sufficient for my existence that they have such a part? Could I exist without a soul? That's the first question. But the second question is, would it be enough just to have a soul? Wouldn't I need a body as well? So, what is it for a person to continue to exist over time? It cannot be merely to have a body, since however well my body functions, once I have lost any capacity for thought and feeling, and these are irrecoverable by normal means, I am dead. Consider those sad cases where a person's body is kept functioning by artificial means, and a judge has to determine whether someone's life support should be turned off. The judge would decide that it should be turned off only if doctors can reasonably assure the judge that the person has no conscious awareness, no thoughts or feelings or sensations, and that no surgical intervention could restore that awareness. And that shows that what is logically sufficient for the person's existence is that they have the capacity for conscious awareness. But is it logically possible that there should exist a person and so a soul, which is necessary for the existence of a person, with a capacity for thought and feeling, yet without a body? That is it conceivable that even if I do lose my body, I still exist? Because if it is, it must be my soul that keeps me going. And how do you decide whether some proposition is logically possible? The only way to decide that is by showing that it is conceivable. We can make sense of supposing that it is true. And the only way to show that a proposition is conceivably true is along the lines argued by David Chalmers, to modally imagine in detail what it would be like for one state of affairs in which the proposition is true. And if, however full and detailed is what you imagine, you fail to find any contradiction entailed by what you imagine, then it is highly probable that what you imagine is conceivable, and so that it is logically possible. There is no other way of deciding what is logically possible. It is crucial for Descartes' argument in his discourse on the method to his conclusion that he is a soul, that, in his view, it is conceivable that when he is thinking, he has no body. For maybe, he says, he just dreams that he has a body. Now here is a different particular example where we might find Descartes' example not convincing, but here is, I hope, a rather better one, where almost all of us can find it conceivable that some other person does not have a body. To have a body is to have a physical substance, a chunk of matter through which one can make a difference to the physical world and through which one learns about the physical world. I have a body only if there is some material arrangement of matter which is such that I learn about the world through it and I make a difference to the world through it. I make a difference to the world by moving some of its bits. I learn about the world by input onto my sense organs, eventually affecting my brain. To have a body is to have a lump of matter through which I act and through which I learn. Now, we have all heard reports of near-death experiences of patients undergoing an operation. Sometimes they report to be unable to control their body and also to have experiences of floating above the operating table at some time and seeing what was happening there when the surgeons certify that the brains of those persons were totally intact, and when the patients report accurately what was happening on the table when they couldn't have learned that by any ordinary means. Now, we may reasonably suppose that really the patients didn't have those experiences at exactly the same time as their brains were totally inactive, or that surgeons may sometimes judge a patient's brain to be totally inactive while there's still some activity in the brain. That is to say, I'm not arguing that these experiences are as described, but we can certainly understand what the reports are claiming. We couldn't reject them as false if we didn't know what they were claiming, and we understand what they are claiming. We are claiming that somebody knows something and is having conscious experiences at a time when their brains, and so their body in total is not under their control, and when it is not providing any information for them. But certainly I suggest we can understand what the reports claim, and fairly evidently those reports do not entail any contradiction. The reports entail that at the time of their near-death experiences, the patient could not control anybody or learn about the world through anybody, and so their conceivable, though possibly false claims, were claims that they were having experiences at that time when they did not have a body. We can develop this scenario at considerable length without finding any contradiction, and that makes it very probable, though not absolutely certain, that however long we went investigating, we would not find a contradiction involved in that supposition. And from that, it follows that it is very probable that it is logically possible that a person's soul could exist without their body, that our conception of a person and our conception of the soul, as I've described it earlier in the lecture, is such that it is logically possible that the soul could exist and so the person could exist, or vice versa, the person could exist and so the soul could exist without the body. Now, most contemporary philosophers hold that there is a concept of metaphysical modality, different from that of logical modality, such that while what is logically impossible is also metaphysically impossible, what is logically possible may not be metaphysically possible, and what is metaphysically impossible is meant to be impossible in just such a strong sense as what is logically possible, and what is metaphysically possible is supposed to be just as weak as a sense as what is logically possible. Given that there is such a concept, it follows that if, as I have argued, having a soul is logically necessary for my existence, it is also metaphysically necessary. But it does seem open to question then whether while having a soul is logically sufficient for my existence, it is also metaphysically sufficient. Whether a proposition, and so the state of affairs which it designates, is metaphysically possible, depends on what that mysterious notion of metaphysical possibility amounts to. In my view, for which I do not have the time to argue here, metaphysical possibility reduces to logical possibility. But whether it does or not, notoriously, any claim that some proposition is logically possible but not metaphysically possible, or metaphysically impossible but not logically impossible, always proves highly contentious and seems to depend on conflicting intuitions. For example, some philosophers claim that it's not metaphysically possible that there's a person with the same kind of body and brain as mine who is not conscious. And other philosophers claim that it is metaphysically possible, and there seems no generally agreed principle whereby the dispute can be resolved. But I hope that in my example of the near-death experiences, it seems to you, as it seems to me, that it is not merely, that it is practically possible. That is to say, experiments might be done which show without too much difficulty what is happening at the time when there was no physical substance through which the person could influence the world or the world could influence him. I must say the experiments would show, but we know what experiences would show that, and it is undoubtedly conceivable that the experiment could be done and the results could be shown, not merely in an abstract way, but as a practical possibility, a possible result of an experiment. And then it would be reasonable to conclude, if the experiments went the right way, that the person was having experiences when he did not have a body, and so that having a soul was not physically possible without a body, and so clearly not metaphysically impossible for the soul to exist and function without a body. If something can be shown to be physically possible, it cannot be physically possible that the experiment might have a certain result. It cannot be logically impossible, or impossible in any sense as strong as that, for it to be true. I conclude that it is not logically or metaphysically possible for a person to exist without a body. Not logically impossible for a person to exist without a body, and therefore it is logically and so metaphysically possible for a person to exist with only a soul, and I therefore conclude that having a soul is sufficient for a person to exist, and I've earlier argued that it's necessary, so being both necessary and sufficient for the existence of a person, that's what we are, souls. Thank you. Can't see any hands. Oh, yes, there's one at the back.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm wondering, it seems to me that in your theory, two people are the same if they correspond to the same soul. But doesn't this just reduce the problem of personal identity to the problem?
Sorry, will you speak fairly sharply and fairly slowly?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It seems to me that in your theory, two people are the same if they correspond to the same soul. But does this just reduce the problem of personal identity to the problem of soul identity? What if soul can also have some complex structure so that it can lose some part, but they are still the same soul? Is this something that can be knowable or something?
Good question. I certainly do discuss this issue in the book, but for reasons of time, I didn't discuss it here. It seems, given that its connection or absence of connection with the body doesn't determine which soul it is, it would seem that having a particular soul is an irreducible fact. It's just, I mean, there must be some irreducible things in terms of which we analyze other things. If you say, what makes that chair, well, it's its shape and so on, and it's the matter of which it is made, and yes, well, what makes the atom the same as an atom the same as an atom in that chair? Well, you come down to one of two answers between which physicists are arguing. One is that some fundamental particles have the same properties but are different solo numero. They're just different. The other answer is that they're really what makes a particle the particle it is simply its properties, which it shares with other examples, e.g. other electrons, and what makes it that particular electron is just its place in the chair. But in that case, of course, there would be no difference in a chair if the atoms, the electrons had been swapped around. It would still be the same chair. So at some level, you have to say things are ultimate. That's just how it is. And I think there's a very strong case for thinking that's just how it is with souls. all that science could do with regard to the soul is show that at a certain stage of human development, 6 months, eventually the fetus becomes conscious. And if it's conscious, then it will have a soul. But no science could show which soul it could have. That is to say, the same scientific laws could operate and produce someone who grew up like me, talked like me, had the same experiences I do, but was a different person. This is just one of the ultimates. And if you try and analyze it in some term, then you come down to a different item that just is what it is. That's all there is, I'm afraid. But souls just are ultimates. And as physicists argue with respect to some physical particles, that they are just the particles they are, even if their properties were the same as those of some other electron.
Hey, Richard. Hi. So I wonder what you think of a possible counterexample to your argument from the principle of the identity of composites.
Yeah.
So you say, since the two different logically possible persons who might result from the same operation, P1 and someone who is not P1, have and always have had all the same physical parts and all the same physical and mental properties, in order for one of them to be different from the other one of them, she must have a different mental part, which the other person lacks. Well, I am no expert in the philosophy of Duns Scotus, but I'm given to understand from people who are, and from reading him, that he felt that in order to move from a common nature, for instance, rational animality, to an individual nature, for instance, Socrates' rational animality, you need to adjoin to the common nature a hexaity. And a hexaity sounds a lot like what you were sort of just saying is the case of souls as you conceive them. They're sort of fundamentally individuated entities or individuating entities. I don't think hexaeities, as Scotus thought of them, are mental parts or mental properties. So maybe somebody could respond to your argument by supposing that the two overlapping substances, though they had all the same physical parts with all the same physical and mental properties, nevertheless were individuated by the virtue of the one having a hexaity which the other one lacks. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm very pleased to include Duns Scotus as expounding the same view as mine, and indeed in an appendix to an earlier book of mine, The Evolution of the Soul, I did have an appendix saying that this seemed to be what Scotus was getting at. He didn't spell out very much, at least I'm no Scotus expert either, and I don't think the Scotus expert is present. He didn't spell out very precisely what it was to have a hexaity, but I think this is what he was getting at. And yes, that's just it. The person, I don't remember whether he talks about the soul very much in this connection, but the person has to have a hexaity which is not analyzable in any of these ways. And yes, he was right.
Thank you so much for your talk. I particularly liked the idea that personal identity is all or nothing, and that you link the all or nothing character of personal identity to the indivisibility of the soul or the principle that explains personal identity. But I wanted to interrogate the sort of assumption behind the question, I am my soul. Because at the beginning of the talk, you described the I as going with conscious experience. And there I think there's a big, so I wondered whether you and Aquinas are actually answering the same question when he says, I am not my soul, and you say, I am my soul. Because I don't think his notion of the I, he thinks of the referent of the I, the pronoun I, as being the entirety of this substance that is speaking the pronoun I, which includes the body, which I think is a different assumption than the one that you're starting with when you say, I am my soul, but only referring to the seat of conscious experience. So I was wondering what would be the justification for thinking of the I as going with conscious experience, as opposed to the broader referent of the pronoun I?
Yes, it would be rather odd to say that my soul weighs 10 stone, as it were. Is that what you're getting at? Yes, but I think you can, given my claim, you can analyze statements about I, which clearly imply something about the body, which I have, in certain obvious ways. I mean, if it's I weigh 10 stone, then this is to say that the body connected to my soul weighs 10 stone. And similarly for other statements about me which imply a body, yes, it's what I am trying to delineate is what makes it the case that something is my body, and that means that it is connected to the essential part of me, just as, yeah, sure.
Thank you, Professor. I was wondering if prenatal injury law, or how it affects your theory that you've argued today. We have in this country basically 50 jurisdictions which hold that if an embryo at any time after conception is injured, and of course based on proof and medical developments and science and so forth, that injury is demonstrated to exist after birth, that there is continuity there between the embryo and the born individual. So the implications are before consciousness, before brain, before parts, the embryonic individual is the same as the born one.
Yes. Well, my view is that we have no grounds for supposing that there is a soul before we have grounds for supposing that the fetus is conscious. I don't wish to deny, of course, that I can exist at a time without being conscious, e.g. due to certain moments of sleep. But what makes it the case that that doesn't affect the fact that I have a soul is that I can easily be woken up. But if I can't be woken up, then there is no soul anymore in connection with my body. Now, it may be the case that at conception we are, what is conceived is not merely a physical unit, but a soul connected to it, but the soul doesn't show itself until it manifests particularly soul-like attributes, that is consciousness, at the 6th month. So I would certainly claim that there is no good reason to suppose, it might be true, but there's no good reason to suppose that any abortion before the 6 months constitutes murder. Of course, it might be wrong for other reasons, but it couldn't be wrong for that reason. Does that get at the sort of point you are making?
Well, the law, tort law today is in all tort law today in all jurisdictions extends the prenatal injury back to conception, but even in the criminal law, that is the case going back to approximately 1600.
And of course, I think Aquinas would agree with me about this matter, because Aquinas thought that the fetus started by being a vegetable and then became an animal and then became, at a slightly later stage, humans. And he got this view from Aristotle. So it puzzles me a little why the modern Catholic Church is so convinced that souls appear on the scene after simply at conception. It may be saying, well, it's better to be safe than sorry, but I can't see it has any very good reason for that claim.
This will be the last question.
That's a great honor to have the last question. In regards to the argument, it seems to hinge...
Please, a little louder, but a little sharper, if you
I will
could.
try. As a German, I can speak very sharp. No, I'm just kidding. The argument seems to hinge on the importance of the brain for our consciousness, feelings, etc. But for example, I think of Thomas Fuchs, who in The Economy of the Brain states that the brain is, the brain's importance for our consciousness, our identity is overstated by neuroscientists. He's a philosopher and he's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. So the question is, if that is really true, that the brain might be not as important to personal identity as you make it, but the entirety, the hexatus, so he's actually following the previous speaker, then where would that lead us?
I'm sorry, it's my hearing, but I haven't quite got that.
So the question would be, what if the brain is not as important for our thought and consciousness as, for example, Fuchs states in
I get the
Economy
point.
of the Brain?
I was, of course, assuming that all consciousness does depend on the cortex. Were it to be shown that some other part of the brain or even some other part of the body had a role, the same arguments as I have given would apply, as it were. That is to say, if it's a part, it can be divided into parts. And the same argument then goes through.
Well, I think a hearty round of applause is in order. If there's anything left over here, you're welcome to take it. I also, well, as Professor Swinburne's driver, I can assure you he's not just about to dash off, so there will still be time for a little bit more dialogue if you wish.